Public Debt Management and Australia's Macroeconomic Priorities by William Mitchell and Warren Mosler. Section 6. Conclusion. Reviewing the Macroeconomic Strategy. The type of reasoning underlying the review applies to a fixed exchange rate regime. With flexible exchange rate, where monetary policy is freed from supporting the exchange rate, there is no reason for CGS issuance. This section briefly outlines the policy options that are then available. We begin this paper with the self-praise of Federal Treasurer, Treasury 2002, linking the alleged success of his government's fiscal strategy since 1996 with the strength of the Australian economy, further stating, quote, "The government's fiscal strategy is to maintain budget balance, on average, over the course of the economic cycle," end quote. Treasury 2002. In terms of the macroeconomic priorities outlined in Section 2.3, the government's fiscal strategy has failed. The most robust fact over the last 25 years is that actual GDP growth has not been strong enough to achieve and sustain full employment, given the preferences of the labor force. Mitchell and Carlson, 2001. The problem of labor underutilization is more severe than is portrayed by official unemployment. Mitchell and Carlson, 2002, show that while the official rate averaged 7.5% between 1996 and mid-2002, the average total labor wastage approximated 13.6% once hidden unemployment and underemployment are included. This translates directly into large output losses. Despite the government rhetoric that the, quote, strategy has contributed to Australia's sound macroeconomic framework and continuing strong economic performance, end quote, the recent economic growth has been in spite of the contractionary fiscal policy. Growth since 1996 has largely reflected increased private sector leveraging as private deficits have risen. Further, the recent ability of the Australian economy to partially withstand the world slowdown is due to the election-motivated reversal of the government's fiscal strategy, which generated the first deficit in 2001 to 2002, since 1996 to 97. A return to the pursuit of surpluses will ultimately be self-defeating. For all practical purposes, any fiscal strategy ultimately results in a fiscal deficit as unsustainable private deficits unwind. But these deficits will be associated with a much weaker economy than would have been the case if appropriate levels of net government spending had been maintained. Treasurer Costello says that by running budget surpluses, the government is saving, and these resources are then able to be used by the private sector. Costello, 1998. The government sees a virtue in retiring net government debt, but a government surplus is an equal reduction in non-government net income and net financial assets, as witnessed by the decline in CGS outstanding. This net income and resulting net financial assets serve as the equity that supports the private sector's credit structure. By removing this net income and net financial assets, government budget surpluses undermine the credit structure, which ultimately readjusts to its reduced equity base. Minsky, 1986. The economy will only sustain high levels of output after the government realizes deficits sufficiently large to restore necessary income and equity to support an expanding private sector credit structure. Further, the government does not require budget surpluses to retire debt. The government can retire debt at any time it wants by using the RBA support rate rather than CGS for interest rate support when it spends, credits member bank RBA accounts, more than it taxes, debits member bank RBA accounts. Additionally, the RBA always has the open option to purchase and thereby retire remaining CGS outstanding. Again, this simply exchanges one private sector asset, CGS, for another, RBA member bank balances. While net taxation revenue will also retire debt, we repeat that this will ultimately not reduce cumulative government deficit spending and therefore, in the long term, not retire debt. We close by repeating the basic lesson of macroeconomics. Firms produce to meet expected spending. All output will be sold if spending equals the sum of all income. If an agent spends less than its income, output will go unsold unless another agent goes into debt and buys that output. If there is a generalized net desire to save, output will go unsold and the stock buildup will lead to declining production and employment. The reverberations of the lost income generate a downward spiral in output. In this situation, the economic outcome depends entirely on the policy response by government. If demand for private production falls, but people still desire to work, then there is no valid reason not to switch them to public goods production until private demand recovers. Unemployment results when the policy response inhibits this switch. Surprisingly, most commentators and public officials fail to realize that the unemployed, supported by welfare measures, are already in the public sector. A sensible policy response would utilize this capacity to both attempt to produce socially beneficial outputs and reduce socially detrimental reactions to unemployment. In this regard, we have proposed to let market forces determine the level of government deficit spending. A fixed wage job guarantee policy can attenuate any tendency towards financial instability and provide the switch between private and public sector employment over the business cycle. See Mitchell, 1998, Mitchell and Mosler, 2002, as well as provide an anchor effect to the price level. We find it ironic that during a time of heightened appreciation of market forces, the option to let market forces determine the size of the fiscal deficit has not been open to discussion. But we do not find it surprising, as the presumed fixed exchange rate assumptions and restrictions take precedence.